Welcome to the channel Manuscript of Horrors, and today we have the story, A Stranger Joined Our Paranormal Support Group. He shouldn't have. I ignored the dead woman standing behind Pete. Well, tried to. I'd gotten pretty good at not looking at her, but not listening was another matter. Drip, drip, drip. Was it blood that perpetually rolled down her fingers, or something worse? No way of knowing without looking. My eyes burned with the temptation to take a peek. Just a quick one. Surely it wouldn't do any. I blinked hard and focused on what Pete was saying. No Shirley tonight? Kids have come down with the flu. I volunteered for setup duty. I gestured down the corridor. Shall we? I led the way, careful to keep my eyes away from windows, shiny doorknobs, unexpected puddles, anything that might cast a reflection. When we reached our room, I paused, casting Pete a sidelong look. Do you want to? He knew the drill. No setting foot in the room. Not yet. With exaggerated casualness, he leaned against the wall and fixed his eyes on the ceiling, while I opened the door and hurried inside. I fumbled the key into the storage cupboard lock and found what I needed within easy reach. Thank God for Shirley's organizational skills. All but sprinting back to the door, I uncorked the jar and drew a thick line of salt just inside the threshold. I caught the briefest glimpse of bare feet. Bloated, the corpse white flesh shot through with blue. Dark, viscous liquid pooled around the rotting toes. Then Pete stepped over the salt line. I was running to the log an instant removing of blood. We also make the monk's place to the Kamano. Then Pete stepped over the wordled 1959 that salt for a good. Rimming red of the jar, we have Fred with a cleaning flit. The move, and then Pete stepped over the blood from a budget flet. Pete stepped over the salt and walked briskly to the storage cupboard, closing the door behind him with a firm click. That left me to deal with the blinds. It wasn't Pete's fault. It wouldn't be fair to expect him to do it. No amount of logic prevented the wave of resentment I felt as I wrestled with the ever-tangling cords, jaw clenched, waiting to hear tap, tap, tap. My mouth went dry. Just to my right, on the other side of the glass, was a glob of black ooze and... was that a fingernail? It's no wonder the cleaners hate us. The words erupted from my lips before I could stop them, followed by a giggle that sounded more like a shriek. Acknowledgement. Bad idea. But it broke the heavy silence of the room, cleared my head long enough for me to win the battle with the blinds. With the outside world at last shut out, I allowed myself a moment, just long enough for my hands to stop trembling. By the time I made it back to the storage cupboard, I'd managed to plaster a smile onto my face. Pete had already retrieved his talisman. He sat cross-legged on the floor, gripping the dog-eared book so tightly his knuckles had turned white. When he heard the door open, he looked up expectantly. All clear, I confirmed. Rough week? I bit my tongue on the question as he scrambled to his feet. It seemed rude not to ask, particularly when the circles under his eyes were so much darker than usual. But now was not the time. Our first and most important rule made that clear. We dragged the chairs out in silence and set them in a circle in the middle of a room. Pete retrieved 5 thick white candles, one for each of us, and positioned them next to the chairs, while I retrieved the box of talismans. At the bottom was a jumble of metal tokens, symbols of a dozen different faiths. They were a hangover from the early days when it was just me and Shirley, fumbling our way through the darkness. None of our eventual regulars turned out to be particularly religious, not even Stephen, our former man of the cloth. We all preferred something a little more personal. A teddy bear worn nearly threadbare, a near-full bottle of whiskey, a dog's rubber bone imprinted with the tooth marks of its former owner. I dug out mine, a keyring bearing a photo of a seaside town, and pocketed it. The cat tree was too cumbersome for either of us to manage alone, so we wrestled that into position together before parting again to finish up. Pete conducted a thorough search of the room, rifling through every drawer and dropping to his knees to crawl beneath tables. We weren't the only ones to use this room. A compact mirror misplaced by the Knitting for Anxiety group could prove disastrous. While he did his rounds, I set out the laminated rule cards. By now, I knew them by heart, but I scanned through them nonetheless. As Shirley often told us, taking a couple of minutes to refresh our memories could save us a lifetime of suffering. Discussion must not begin until all protective measures are in place. Any members with followers must not enter the room until the salt line has been drawn. Cover any reflective surfaces. Once the candles are lit, no one can leave until they have burned out. Don't be a dick. Everyone's stories are valid, even if they don't match your own. Listen when someone is talking. You'll have your own turn to speak. Keep an eye on Ed. Daphne breezed in just as we finished, wearing her favorite fluffy pink jumper and carrying an enormous tin of biscuits. She gave Pete an assessing look before thrusting the tin into his arms. "You're looking too thin. Eat," she ordered. She gave me a quick hug before scooping the teddy bear out of the talisman box, holding it in her lap as she plopped into one of the seats. Mary came next, scowling and sporting a livid black eye. Daphne made a little squeak of dismay. "You poor love. What happened?" She caught herself, clapping a hand over her mouth and staring wide-eyed around the rest of us. "Don't worry," Mary reassured her. "The fist that did this was human." "Who'd be daft enough to take a swing at you?" I asked, incredulous. Short she might be, but when Mary wasn't running the pub, she was pitching in at her brother's farm. Between hauling barrels and bales, her arms might as well have been made of steel. "Punter who'd had a few too many." She plucked the dog toy from the box, clenching her fist around it. The squeaker had long since died, but it emitted a sad puff of air. "He's barred now." "Just barred?" I raised my eyebrows. The corners of her lips twitched. Maybe a bit bruised, too. Stephen arrived last, a few minutes after our designated start time. Sorry," he panted as he wrestled the yowling carrier through the door. He did not want to cooperate tonight. He placed the carrier on the floor with a thud, opened the door, and beat a hasty retreat. Ed stalked out, tail twitching in irritation. He turned his baleful green eyes on Stephen, who held up his hands in surrender. "Don't be a sourpuss," Daphne cooed. "Poor old Stevie had to get you here somehow." All around the room, hands reached into pockets. They produced little chunks of cheese, cat biscuits, leftover scraps of chicken. Ed accepted our offerings like a king receiving gifts from his subjects. Mollified, he allowed us to pet him for a minute before sauntering to the cat tree and cleaning the sleek black fur our filthy human hands had sullied. "Right," I said, looking around the group. "I think we're ready. Shall we make a start?" My stomach churned with the usual mixture of anticipation and dread. I knew the others felt the same, but they moved to take their places nonetheless, Stephen grabbing the bottle of whiskey as he went. "Okay, guys," I said, trying to ignore the feeling of wrongness as I took Shirley's usual seat. It didn't matter how many times I filled in for her. I'd never get used to it. "If you need to go to the loo, make a cup of tea, whatever, now's the time. Once we light the candles, there's no getting up until they burn out." No one moved, of course. They knew to come prepared. "Pete, do you mind?" He pulled a lighter from his jacket, lit his candle, and passed it to Mary. It did a full loop of the circle until it reached me. "We're safe in the circle," I said as I lit my candle. "Not just from the things that haunt us, but from each other. Remember, there's no judgment here. Listen, be kind to one another. Now, who would like to start?" I glanced towards Pete, but he gave a tiny shake of his head, pressing his lips together tightly. "Not ready yet." No matter. I turned instead to Stephen, who cleared his throat. "I'll go, I suppose." He turned the bottle over in his hands. "Danielle emailed me a few days ago." "Danielle? Alfie's mum?" Daphne ventured softly. "The very same. She always gets in touch this time of year. Lets me know how he's getting on. History's his favorite subject. He'll be studying it at uni in a couple of years. Thanks to you, said Mary. You gave him that chance. Pete, thumbing the edges of his book, added, You gave a lot of people chances. Stephen nodded. It's nice to hear about it. The life he might otherwise not have had. Nice to be reminded it's been another year since I chucked this in. He glanced down at the bottle, his grip tightening around its neck. But it's also a reminder that I'm not myself anymore, that I never will be again. His candle flickered, and for a moment his shadow was not his own. It loomed on the wall behind him, its fingers growing, sharpening to points. The air grew heavy around us. Breathing was no longer an unthinking, natural process. It required conscious, painstaking effort. Behind me, on the cat tree, Ed let out a low growl. I glanced at the others in turn. Mary stared straight at Stephen, jaw clenched tight. Daphne held her teddy bear close to her chest. The circles under Pete's eyes looked darker than ever. Twisting a little in my chair, slowly, forcing myself to act as though I hadn't a care in the world, I looked over at Ed. He stared unblinking at the wall behind Stephen, tail snapping from side to side. Perhaps, Stephen's voice emerged a deep rasp, we should move on to someone else. Good idea. Through sheer force of will, I managed to keep my voice light. Sounds like you need a strepsil, mate. Mary snorted. Daphne looked at her like she'd lost her mind, then let out her own small giggle. Even Pete managed to smile. The oppressive feeling vanished as quickly as it had come. Ed resumed licking his paws. My turn, said Mary, drumming the rubber bone against her knee. The little git has been causing hell all week. Before we could find out exactly what the little git had done, the door swung open. A bespectacled young man smiled in at us from the corridor. Is this the Stop Smoking group? They're in here tomorrow, I said. We're something else. Ah, he puffed out his cheeks, disappointed. I'm meant to be leading it. Well, come back at 8 o'clock tomorrow. I'm sure you'll do brilliantly. I don't suppose I could sit in on your session? I've never done one of these things before. I could do with some experience. Bad idea, said Mary abruptly. We're a private group, I explained. You won't even know I'm here, I promise. As he stepped into the room, we all rushed to dissuade him, talking over each other in our panic. You can't. This is private. You don't know. Mary, her face so red it was nearly purple, looked like she was strongly considering battering him with the rubber bone. She couldn't. None of us could leave the circle. All we could do was watch helplessly as he waved off our complaints, grabbed a spare chair, and forced it into the small gap between Daphne and Stephen. The group stared at him, aghast, then, as one, turned their eyes to me. Damn it, Shirley. Why did you breed children with such weak immune systems? Right, I looked at the stranger expectantly. Martin, he supplied. You're here now, Martin, for better or worse. We have strict rules and we expect you to follow them. Of course. I wouldn't dream of disrespecting your group. I bit my tongue down on the comment that barging in uninvited had done just that, and instead said, The most important one is you're now here until the end of the session. No getting up to go to the loo, no smoke breaks. No fear there, he cut in, beaming at me. I smiled weakly back at him. Secondly, we respect each other here. You might hear things that sound strange to you. It's not your place to interrupt or invalidate anyone's experience. I understand how important respect is, he said sincerely. Then, with just the faintest tone of pompousness creeping into his voice, I'm a trained counselor, you know. Is the ink still wet on your certificate? Mary snapped. Mary, I said quietly, less a caution, more a plea. She shot Martin a burning look that suggested she would be having words with him in the car park later, but said nothing further. Would you like me to start? Daphne asked. I felt a rush of affection for her. She was fiddling with the bear's ears, clearly uncomfortable, but she was still trying. "That would be lovely, Daphne." She took a deep, steadying breath. "It's been hard since the nights started getting longer. Winter's always the worst. You know I've got lots of other little berries at home." She picked the bear up by his paws, made him dance a little jig in her lap. "They help, but when I wake up and see it standing there at the bottom of my bed..." She shivered, and when she spoke next, her voice was little more than a whisper. "It's those eyes, sewn shut, but it still stares at me." "Do you all have sleep disorders?" Martin butted in. "No," I said shortly. "And please don't interrupt. Sorry, Daphne, please carry on." "You hear stories about stuff like this," she resumed haltingly. "People seeing terrors in the night. They always seem to be there one moment, gone the next. You all know it doesn't work that way for me. Once it turns up, it's there until sunrise, following me around the house, always watching. It was a bit more bearable when I still had Graham. He used to sit up and watch films with me, hold my hand on the sofa." Her eyes were sparkling now. "In the early days, anyway. By the end, I saw Mary's hands tighten around the bone. I knew how she felt. Logically, I knew I couldn't blame Graham. It took a special sort of person to stick around and deal with this stuff when they didn't have to. And as we'd all learned, those sorts of people were few and far between. Still, I hated him for leaving his poor, sweet wife to suffer alone." Stephen leaned over to Daphne, offering her his handkerchief. She took it with a grateful smile and dabbed her eyes. "Creative writing," Martin burst out. "What?" I asked. "You're a creative writing group, right?" "Mate, you've been told already to keep your gob shut. How hard is it?" Mary demanded, jabbing the bone in his direction. "She's right," I said. "Please don't make me ask you again." When I looked at Daphne, she shook her head, holding the handkerchief tight against her cheek. I raised my eyebrows at Mary. "Fine," she huffed. "I'll go. As I was saying before we were so rudely interrupted," she shot Martin a scorching look. "He's been causing trouble this week. More than usual, I mean." "Has he been in the toilets again?" I asked. "Yes, literally in this case. That's how I ended up with this." She tapped her black eye. "Drunk punter went into one of the stalls, and the little shit popped his head up out the loo. Course, it's not the place you expect to find a little old man in a bowler hat. Freaked him right out. Came running out, ranting and raving, swinging fists." She let out a grunt of dissatisfaction. "Two of my staff gave their notice that night. It's becoming an issue. We don't have a problem hiring. They hear the pub's haunted and think they might get a little laugh, a little scare. But the moment it inconveniences them..." "Wait," Martin interrupted. Mary heaved a heavy sigh. "Here we go. Are you claiming that you're experiencing some sort of, I don't know, genuine paranormal phenomenon?" When Mary's only response was a hard stare, he turned to Daphne. "And you too?" She gave him the smallest nod, just enough to confirm his statement. "Martin," I cut in before he could say anything further, "I was very clear about our rules. We don't invalidate anyone's experiences." "But you should..." No. He caught himself, held up his hands in a gesture of contrition. "You're quite right. Your group, your rules. Please, do continue." Mary's scowl made it clear she had no intention of picking up where she had left off. Pete and Daphne both pointedly ignored my looks. Only Stephen met my eyes. He cleared his throat, then suggested gently, "Perhaps you would like to..." I really wouldn't. Not when Martin was now leaning forward, gaze intent and full of sickening concern. But I could hardly expect the others to open up if I refused to do so myself. "Right." I shifted in my seat, balling my hand into a fist around the keyring. "Yes. Well, you all know how it started. Martin isn't acquainted with the story. I could have swung for Stephen if I wasn't so certain he wasn't intent on torturing me. The rest of us were content to keep our experiences within the confines of our small circle, but he still had a streak of the preacher about him, and it was focused on warning the general public about the dangers we were intimately acquainted with, even if they branded him as crazy for his struggles. "If you wouldn't mind?" "Not at all," The sentiment wasn't entirely convincing through gritted teeth, but it was the best I could manage. When I was a kid, we used to go to the seaside on holiday. I forced my fingers to unfurl and held up the keyring. Here, to be precise. Martin squinted at the keyring, his smile coming too quickly. It looks lovely. It was a bit of a shithole. The smell of greasy chips drifted back to me across the years. I remembered the sky that always seemed to be slate gray, even in summer, and the cold bite of seawater on my thighs. I could feel the musty arcade carpet beneath my cheek, Dad's arms wrapping around me and hauling me against his chest after I dozed off. Somewhere behind him, Mom and Becca bickered about her dress sense, or how her headphones seemed to be glued on, or whatever other piece of teenage rebellion my sister had engaged in to do my mom's head in. I grinned in spite of myself. But it had its good points. Arcades, fish and chips by the sea, that sort of thing. We went every year until we lost my dad. Mom couldn't face it after that. The year after he died, she took us somewhere else instead. Some broken-down old cottage in the middle of nowhere. That must have been very difficult, said Martin somberly. The disruption in routine after... Shh, Mary hissed. Ignoring the interruption, I pressed on. There wasn't much to do there unless you liked looking at trees or playing board games with missing pieces. Mom spent a lot of time sleeping. That left me and Becca, my sister, to entertain ourselves. Becca was going through a phase, as my mom said. That was putting it lightly. Their arguments could rage on for hours, always ending with Becca slamming her bedroom door so hard that the trinkets on my shelves rattled. They were constantly at each other's throats. She'd even started butting heads with Dad before he died, but she always had time for me. I was 11 on that last holiday, and Becca 16. My friends' older siblings wanted nothing to do with them. They were too old, too cool, to be seen in the company of children. Not Becca. She still helped me with my homework, and threatened to slap the shit out of any kids that gave me trouble. I was a little in awe of her. So when she told me there was a way to see Dad again and asked for my help, I agreed. We went to bed that night and waited until we heard Mom snoring. The mixture of excitement and stomach-freezing terror slammed into me, as strong now as it had been more than 20 years ago when I huddled beneath my blanket, waiting for the quiet creak of my door and Becca's summoning whisper. I followed Becca into the woods, and then... What? My memories of that night were fragmented, like a photo album someone had taken a pair of scissors to. I scrunched my eyes shut, pressing my knuckles hard against them as I tried to remember. There was an old book, thick, bound in leather. God knows where she got it. Stole it, knowing Becca. It wasn't in English. I remember that much because she read out loud from it. I flexed the index finger of my left hand, staring down at the thin white scar that ran its length. Becca's hand had been gentle as it held mine. "Sorry, little 'un," she'd whispered as she raised the knife. "I only need a few drops." She took my blood. Flames danced behind my eyes. Dripped it into a fire. When she called out, something answered her. Red eyes piercing the darkness, a growl so deep it reverberated in my bones. But it wasn't Dad. She told me to run. I remembered branches whipping against my cheeks, my chest burning as my lungs desperately tried to squeeze in air. I did. I didn't realize I was crying until someone pressed a handkerchief into my hand. I took it without looking up. Meeting any of their eyes was more than I could bear. The shame was too deep. "You did the right thing," said Mary firmly. "If you hadn't listened to her, you would have been taken too." "Taken?" asked Martin. Daphne spared me from having to answer. Becca vanished that night. Their mom called the police. They searched the woods. Nothing. "You believe someone kidnapped her?" "Something took her," Mary answered in a tone that brooked no argument. Martin was either oblivious to the warning or chose to ignore it. "I mean no disrespect to your sister, but it sounds like she was troubled. Arguing with your mom, grieving for your dad. Couldn't she have run away?" "You seem to be under a misapprehension," said Stephen. namely that this was an isolated incident. It wasn't. We have all caught glimpses of this beast. For the 1000th time, I sent up a silent prayer of thanks for my friends. The first time it had returned, 1 year to the day after the night Becca led me into the woods, I was alone. I lay frozen in bed as its red eyes pierced me through the darkness, quaking each time it let out another growl. Staring into its terrible eyes nearly cost me my sanity, but I didn't dare look away, barely dared to blink, certain it would pounce if I gave it an opening. I'd weathered the next few anniversaries in my mom's bed, clinging to her arm as she slept the deep sleep of the medicated. When I left home, I took to spending those nights in churches. Finally, I found a group of friends willing to sit in vigil with me. Martin made to rise from his chair and was immediately greeted by a chorus of, "No!" from all sides. Blanching, he dropped back down. Instead, he sought my eyes, his gaze full of sympathy. "I really am sorry for what happened. Losing your dad, then your sister, and at such a young age. But," he hesitated, fiddling with the cuffs of his jumper, before seeming to come to a decision. "Monsters like the thing you're talking about don't exist. You know that, right?" I took a deep breath and did my very best to keep my tone level as I replied, "How do you explain it then?" "Grief, trauma. They can do strange things to a person." "And the fact that we have all seen it too?" asked Stephen. Martin swiveled in his seat to face him. "Group delusions and hallucinations are documented phenomena, particularly in tight-knit groups that share a belief system." Mary scoffed, opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, tap, tap, tap.
We all froze, except for Martin. I was vaguely aware that he was still laying out theories, building up steam, but my focus was entirely on the tapping coming from the other side of the window. I knew better than to look, but I couldn't help but listen. The others, the members, had paled. Pete's face had little more color than a cadaver. Across the room, a deep rumble was building in Ed's throat. What do I do? Shirley would know, damn it. I looked from face to face and saw my own panic reflected there. Stephen rescued us. "Young man, I appreciate you've heard things that are contrary to your world view." There was an undeniable tremor to his voice, but he pressed on. "It's difficult. I understand that. It does not excuse your unconscionable rudeness. We ask only for respect. You have failed to give that to us." "I don't mean any disrespect." Martin pressed an earnest hand to his heart. "But there's no such thing as ghosts and goblins and things that go bump in the night. Such beliefs stem from illness." Tap. Ed began to growl properly now, a low, guttural sound that rose up to fill the gaps in the room. Mary opened her mouth, but Stephen held up a finger to forestall her. "In some cases, that's true. Not in others. Certainly not in ours." "There's medication that can help you," Martin insisted. "Therapies." "This is our therapy," Stephen said coldly. "It's not. It's a shared delusion. It's only going to make you worse. You need..." Tap. Martin whipped his head towards the shuttered window. "Do you hear that?" "No," said Stephen, "but we've heard quite enough out of you." Tap. "There it is again. Surely you can hear it." "We don't know what you're talking about," I said. "Your cat does." He gestured towards Ed, who was now standing, claws digging into the fabric beneath his paws, eyes locked on the window. "It's coming from over there." "Don't!" we shouted in unison as he made to rise from his seat once more. He dropped back down with a thud. As he looked from one person to another, realization dawned on his face. "You think it's some sort of monster, don't you?" Silence, but for the tapping. "I'm going to go over there." "Please don't," Daphne whispered, "and show you there's nothing to be afraid of." "It'll be the end of you, you bloody fool," said Mary. Martin stood up. Stephen jerked reflexively, as if he was about to go after him. He caught himself at the last moment, gripping the seat of his chair to anchor himself in place. "Martin." His voice was low and urgent now.
I've participated in dozens of exorcisms in my time. I've seen things that have stretched my belief to the point of breaking. Everything I've seen, all my experience, tells me one thing. If you go over there, you will die. Why risk it? Said Mary. If there's even the slightest chance he's right, you're gambling with your life. The look Martin gave her was soft and full of pity. If I play along with this delusion, I'm only hurting you. He stepped outside the circle. With every step he took, we pleaded, begging him to come back, to sit in the safety of the circle. When he reached the window and made to raise the blind, Pete wrapped a trembling hand around my wrist and shook his head. I nodded acknowledgement. It's too late, I murmured, and when the others still clamored at Martin, raised my voice to a shout. It's too late! Just don't look! I grabbed Pete's hand on one side and Stephen's on the other. A moment's hesitation, in which their faces cycle through denial, fury, and, finally, helpless resignation, before the others followed suit and joined hands. How the fuck did this happen? Mary spat. We turned our eyes to the floor. Silence now, but for Ed's yowling, and beneath it, the soft click of the window opening. Hello? Martin called. Then, see, there's nothing there. It must have been the branches on the... Oh. Pete's nails dug into my skin. Are you okay? The slightest tremor entered Martin's voice. You look... I think he realized his mistake at the end. There was a clattering, as though he'd tried to jerk back and slam the window shut, only to become tangled in the blinds. I think he tried to scream. He only managed a sharp inhale, a muffled groan. Heavy thudding followed, like feet pounding against the ground and finding no purchase. Then silence, except for Ed. His screeching had died down to a continuous growl, low and full of warning. As for us, the survivors of yet another deadly night, we could only remain in the circle, stuck there until the candles burned down. I didn't dare look up, but I could hear Daphne's soft whispering and Pete muttering something unintelligible beneath his breath. At last, the candles began to burn out. When the last flame guttered, Pete shot up and ran as fast as his shaking legs could carry him to the storage cupboard. Daphne followed after him, arms wrapped tight around her waist. As she turned to close the door behind them, I saw her cheeks were wet. Sorry, she mumbled. I just can't. That left me, Mary, and Stephen to deal with the aftermath. Mary's fingers had punctured the rubber bone, and Stephen looked as though he hadn't had to fight the urge to open his bottle so hard in years. But when I looked into their faces, I saw they were resolved. On 3, I suggested. When they both nodded, I reminded them, don't look out the window. I counted us down. We looked in unison. Martin lay slumped half out of the window. Something stood beyond him, staring in at us from outside. Our well-trained eyes refused to see it. If I get that window shut, can you move the... My lips refused to form the word body, but they understood. On it, boss, said Mary. They went first, Mary leading the way with her mouth set in a grim line. Grabbing hold of one of Martin's legs each, they heaved. He came free of the window and landed on the floor with a sickening thud. The moment he was clear, I moved in. For a dreadful moment, my arm refused to move. I was frozen in place, trapped by the fear that cold fingers would wrap themselves around my wrist when I reached for the window. They've done their part, I told myself. Now it's your turn. As I reached for the handle, I saw the woman standing outside. Still, silent, mere feet away. I allowed my eyes to slip out of focus, giving no sign I had seen her, other than the hammering of my heart, which I was certain filled the whole room. I snatched the window shut, then closed the blinds on her dreadful form. Only then did I allow myself to take a deep breath as I turned to inspect our next problem. The only outward signs of damage were the rivulets of blood that had trickled from Martin's ears, oozing down to stain the shoulders of his jumper. That, and his eyes. They were wide and glazed, frozen open by the horror he had witnessed. The last thing he would ever witness. "What are we going to do with him?" said Mary, her voice clipped. "Do we call the police?" "And tell them what?" I asked. "I don't know," she shrugged. "We could say he collapsed. And how do we explain why we waited hours before calling for help?" I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering. "They'll start poking around into what we do here, then. Next thing you know, we end up locked away in some hospital," finished Mary. "At best," I murmured. "I'll sort it," said Stephen. He was staring at Martin's corpse, face pale and clammy. "That could be dangerous," cautioned Mary. "I can handle it," he said sharply, running a shaking hand over his mouth. "I wouldn't have suggested it otherwise." I hesitated. "Do you want company, or would you prefer if we—" "Privacy is preferable." On the cat tree, Ed had finally fallen silent, but he turned his lamp-like eyes on Stephen, tail twitching. As I ushered Mary to the storage cupboard, Stephen called after us hoarsely, "Draw a salt line, just in case." We slipped inside, to where Daphne and Pete were waiting for us, her arm wrapped tightly around his shoulder. They glanced at us, read our grim looks, and looked quickly away again. When I turned to close the door, I caught a glimpse of Stephen, his jaw unhinging, dropping down to his chest as his teeth sharpened into fangs. He advanced on Martin, his clawed hands grasping. I slammed the door and reached for the salt.